Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. What was supposed to be a peaceful solo camping trip to the Shadow Ridge Wilderness in Northern California quickly spiraled into something I could never have prepared for. I had just quit my job at a tech startup in San Francisco, exhausted by the relentless grind, and broken things off with my boyfriend of 3 years. I needed space to think, breathe, and be alone. So I packed my RV and headed for the wilderness. The Shadow Ridge Wilderness had always called to me. I'd seen pictures of its jagged peaks, pristine lakes, and dense forests, and it seemed like the perfect place to find myself, or at least escape everything for a while. I reached the trailhead near Silverstone Lake on a Tuesday afternoon. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for one dusty old pickup truck. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant rush of a waterfall and the occasional chirp of birds. The hike to the lake was grueling but beautiful. Towering trees formed a canopy above, their branches filtering the sunlight into golden beams. By the time I reached my campsite, my legs were shaking, and I could feel blisters forming on my heels. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, the water so clear I could see fish darting between the rocks. After a quick meal of granola bars and jerky, I crawled into my sleeping bag, ready for a long, uninterrupted sleep. But the forest had other plans. The first night, I woke to the sound of snapping branches. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear through the thin walls of the tent. It could have been a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Snap, crack. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine a beam into the woods. The trees stood still, their shadows stretching long and dark, but I saw no animals. No movement. "Get it together, Emily," I muttered, zipping the tent closed and forcing myself to lie back down. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. About 50 yards from my campsite, someone, or something, had carved a symbol into the bark of a tree. It was a spiral, crudely etched but unmistakable. I stared at it for a long moment, my gut telling me to leave, but I shook off the feeling. It was probably nothing, a prank by other hikers, maybe, or some kind of trail marker. Still, as I packed my day bag and headed out to explore the area, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midday, I ran into another camper. He was sitting on a rock by the trail, sharpening a knife. "Hey!" I called out, relieved to see another person. "Beautiful day, huh?" He looked up, his face weathered and serious. "You camping alone?" I hesitated, unsure whether to lie, but nodded. "Yeah, just for a few days." He stood, tucking the knife into his belt. "You see anything strange?" "Strange? How?" "Symbols. Noises. Things moving where they shouldn't." I froze. "Why?" He glanced around, his expression grim. "They call her the witch. Local legend. She doesn't like people on her land." "Are you serious?" I asked, half laughing to mask my unease. He shrugged. "Believe what you want. But if I were you, I'd head back to the trailhead before nightfall." That evening, I couldn't shake Jack's warning. The forest felt different now, heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching me. I decided to keep a fire going as long as I could. Sitting by the flickering flames, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Then the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just snapping branches. There were whispers, faint and unintelligible but definitely human or close to it. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the forest, my breath catching as the beam illuminated something hanging from a tree. It was a bundle of twigs and moss tied together with what looked like strands of hair. Beneath it, the ground was littered with small bones. I backed away, my heart pounding. That's when I saw her. She was standing just beyond the firelight, her silhouette barely visible between the trees. At first, I thought it was another hiker, a woman, tall and thin, but something about her posture was wrong. She was too still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I grabbed a stick from the fire, holding it like a torch, and took a tentative step forward. The woman moved then, but not toward me. Instead, she turned and glided deeper into the forest. Her movements were unnervingly smooth. Against every instinct, I followed. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the whispers growing louder. I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, as if the forest itself were alive and restless. Finally, I emerged into a small clearing. At its center was an ancient stone altar, overgrown with moss and surrounded by the same spirals I had seen on the tree. The woman stood beside it, her back to me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her face was gaunt and pale, her eyes sunken and black, her lips curled into a jagged smile as she reached out a clawed hand. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like the crack of dry branches. I ran. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as I stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear her laughter, high-pitched and echoing, as if it were coming from all around me. When I finally made it back to camp, I grabbed my keys and bolted for the RV. The engine sputtered as I turned the key, but it roared to life just as a shadow fell across the windshield. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I didn't stop driving until I was miles from the trailhead, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. Back in the city, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a mix of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of branches snapping outside my window, and I wonder if I left the witch behind, or if she followed me home. My name is Alex Carter, I'm 34 years old, and this happened in October 2022 when I decided to spend a week camping alone in the Mojave Desert. I don't know why I chose such a remote, unforgiving place. Maybe I was drawn to its emptiness, its stark beauty, but whatever the reason, I'm never going back. The first few days back in the city were the hardest. I tried to keep busy, tried to block out the memories, but every time I walked through the streets, I felt like I was being watched. It was as if the shadows followed me, lurking just out of sight. The sound of cracking branches, the faint whispers, they lingered in my mind, sometimes waking me in the middle of the night. I couldn't explain what had happened out there. There were no rational answers, no logical explanations. I asked around about the witch, but no one seemed to know anything concrete. Some people joked about local legends, others looked at me like I was crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was being drawn back to that place. It's not like I wanted to go back, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling, that feeling deep in my gut telling me there was something I missed. Something important. I kept seeing the symbol, the spiral, carved into that tree. It kept haunting me, like it was calling me back, pulling me towards something I couldn't understand. A few months later, I found myself standing at the edge of a different trail, not far from where I had left my RV. The city seemed so far away now, and I wondered if it was foolish to return. But I had to know. I had to figure out what it all meant. The weather was colder this time. The trees seemed more foreboding, their branches tangled and black against the gray sky. I could almost feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me, but I was determined. I had to finish this. I didn't get far before the whispers began again. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling leaves, the creak of branches. But it was different this time. The whispers were clearer. There was a language in them, one I couldn't understand, but that resonated with something deep inside me. It was like they were calling me by name, beckoning me forward. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my breath caught in my throat. The path ahead seemed to grow darker, as though the forest itself was closing in. But I pressed on. When I reached the clearing with the stone altar, my heart dropped. The same spirals were etched into the stones now, larger than before, glowing faintly in the dim light. But there was something different about this place. Something more alive. I couldn't turn back. Not now. I stepped forward, my feet moving almost on their own, my breath shallow. And then I saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the altar, her back to me as before. But now, her posture was different. It was as if she was waiting for me. "You came back," she said, her voice cold and familiar. I wanted to run, to escape. But something inside me told me I needed to hear what she had to say. "Why?" I whispered. Why are you doing this?" She turned slowly, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes empty black pits. The smile stretched across her face like a grotesque mask. "You were always meant to come back. You've been chosen, just like the others." "Others?" I breathed, feeling my stomach tighten. She nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. "Those who wander too far. Who seek answers they're not meant to know." My heart pounded as I took a step back, my mind racing. "What do you want from me?" Her smile widened. "Nothing. You have already given it." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me trembled. The altar shook violently, the spirals glowing brighter. A powerful wind howled through the clearing, and I stumbled backward. The trees around me seemed to groan in pain, their branches swaying as though they were alive. I ran. But this time, the forest didn't just let me go. The branches reached out, tangling in my hair, pulling at my clothes. The whispers grew louder, the voices becoming screams. I could feel her presence behind me, always just out of sight, but I knew she was there. Watching. Waiting. When I finally broke free from the forest's grip, I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. The engine roared to life as I slammed my foot on the pedal, speeding away from the nightmare. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the reflection, was the same woman. Standing in the middle of the road, her dark eyes locked onto mine, her smile twisted and knowing. I don't know if I escaped or if she's still following me. I don't know if I'll ever be free of her. But I'm not going back to that place. And I hope no one else does, either. My name is Alex Carter, and I'm 34 years old. If you ever find yourself in the Mojave Desert, or anywhere near Shadow Ridge, remember this: some things are better left undiscovered. Some things should never be followed. I thought leaving the Mojave Desert behind would finally give me peace, but the nightmares began shortly after. Every night, I would wake drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers echoing in my ears, the image of her face, gaunt and grinning, seared into my mind. I tried to bury it, to push it all away, but it clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Months passed, and life went on. I tried to resume normalcy. I even returned to work, forcing myself to fit back into a routine. But nothing felt the same. The world seemed somehow off. Like I wasn't quite in it anymore. One evening, just before sunset, I received an email from a friend I hadn't heard from in years. Mark Evans. I hadn't spoken to him since that strange camping trip he had told me about back in 2022, the one he spent alone in Death Valley. He'd sent me a link to a blog post titled, "The Witch of Shadow Ridge, Is She Real?" The words in the email chilled me to the core. I'm starting to think I wasn't alone out there. I found something that links what we both experienced. Something ancient. I need you to come. Please, Emily. This is bigger than we know. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My first instinct was to delete the email, to ignore him and never look back. But something in his words felt too familiar, like a part of me had been waiting for this moment. I hesitated. Then, after hours of pacing and battling with my thoughts, I replied, "I'll meet you. Just tell me where." The next week, I found myself on a plane to Nevada, meeting Mark at a quiet diner on the outskirts of a small desert town. He looked different, thinner, like something had drained the life out of him. When he saw me, he stood, his eyes wide with relief, but also a strange fear. "Emily," he said in a hoarse voice, "you're here. You actually came. I wasn't sure you would." I sat down, my heart pounding. "What's going on, Mark? What did you find?" He didn't waste any time. "It's not just a legend," he said, his voice trembling. "There's something out there. Something old, something powerful. And it's been waiting for us." He paused, looking over his shoulder as though expecting someone to be listening. I found the same spirals, the same symbols. But this time, I found something more, an artifact, buried beneath an altar deep in the desert. And when I touched it, I felt her. She's real, Emily. And she's not just haunting the woods. She's tied to the land. To all of it. The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it all. "What do you mean, tied to the land? How? Why us?" Mark took a deep breath. "I don't know. But I've been researching it, trying to find answers. There's a history here, ancient rituals, blood sacrifices. The land is cursed. And we disturbed it. Both of us." His words sent a chill through me. My mind raced, but I couldn't stop thinking about one thing, the woman. The witch. She had always felt like a shadow, something just beyond my reach. But now it was clear, she wasn't just a figment of our imaginations. She was something real. And she was coming for us. "We need to stop it," I whispered, more to myself than to Mark. We need to put an end to this. Mark nodded, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. I've been trying. But every time I get close, he stopped himself, looking away. I don't think I can do it alone. I nodded. Neither can I. The next morning, we drove back to the Mojave Desert. We followed the coordinates Mark had traced to the altar he had uncovered. The sun was setting as we reached the spot, the air thick with heat, the horizon stretching endlessly before us. The desert felt different this time. Silent. Almost expectant. As we approached the clearing, I felt a familiar tension in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. And then, I saw it. The altar, the spirals. But something was different now, darker. The symbols on the stone seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't there before. And standing beside the altar, I saw her again. The woman. This time, her face wasn't hidden in the shadows. Her eyes gleamed black as night, and her smile stretched wide, jagged. She didn't move, but her presence was suffocating, like the very air around us was thick with her. Mark stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. It's her. She's here. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from everywhere, she spoke. You shouldn't have come back. Her voice sent a cold shiver down my spine, but this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I was ready. I reached into my bag and pulled out the artifact Mark had found. It was an old, worn stone, covered in the same spiral symbols that adorned the altar. I raised it, holding it above my head. The woman's smile faltered, just for a moment. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing. You think this will stop me? I didn't answer. I just raised the stone higher, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. And then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a blinding light exploded from the stone, enveloping everything. The woman screamed, a sound that rattled the very bones of the earth. The ground cracked, the air burned with a heat that had no source. Mark and I shielded our eyes, but the light was blinding, and the world around us seemed to vanish. When the light finally faded, everything was silent. I opened my eyes. The desert was still. The symbols on the altar were gone. And the woman, she was gone too. Mark and I stood there for a long time, neither of us speaking, as if waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The curse was lifted. For now. We left the Mojave Desert that day, and I never looked back. The nightmares stopped, the whispers faded. But I can't forget what happened out there. I can't forget the woman, or the land that held her. And I wonder, was it really over? Or had we just made things worse? I don't know. But I'm never going back to find out. My name is Emily Carter. And I hope the witch stays buried in the past where she belongs. Months have passed since that night in the Mojave Desert, and yet, sometimes, it still feels like I'm standing at the edge of that clearing, the weight of the desert pressing down on me. Mark and I haven't spoken much since we parted ways after the ritual. I think we both know there's nothing more to say. We did what we had to do. But I can't help but feel that something is still unfinished, something we didn't fully understand. Every now and then, I still feel that presence, like someone is watching me. It's faint, barely noticeable, but it's there. In the quiet moments, when the world is still and the night is too silent. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the faintest sound of whispers, so quiet, I can barely make them out, but unmistakable. They're always just on the edge of my hearing, and they sound like my name. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then, it happened again last week. I was at home, sitting in my living room, reading a book when I heard the creaking of floorboards behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, expecting to see the shadow of someone in the hallway. But there was no one there. Just the stillness of my apartment. But the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't explain. I brushed it off, told myself I was just tired, maybe stressed. But later that night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers started again. Louder this time, clear as day. Emily. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled the covers tighter around me, my mind racing. The voice was familiar. It sounded like the woman, like the witch from the desert. But I was so sure we had finished this, that we had sent her back into whatever dark corner she had come from. It didn't make sense. Why would she still be here? I spent the next few days doing my best to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. But the strange occurrences kept happening. Objects would shift in my apartment. Things that had been in one place would be moved, and I would hear footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. Each time I turned around, there was nothing. Finally, I decided to reach out to Mark. It had been months since we last spoke, but I needed answers. I needed to know if he was experiencing the same things. When I called him, he didn't sound surprised to hear from me. Instead, he sounded tired, his voice strained. "I knew you'd call eventually," he said. "I've been hearing them too. The whispers. The things moving. I thought it was just me, but it's happening to you too?" I asked, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. Mark sighed. "It's not over, Emily. It never was. We may have stopped the witch in the desert, but I don't think we stopped her power. That land, it's ancient. And we disturbed something bigger than we realized." I could hear the fear in his voice now. "I think we need to go back." The words hit me like a slap to the face. The thought of going back to that place, to the desert, filled me with dread. But part of me knew he was right. The whispers, the strange occurrences, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. I didn't want to go back, but I also didn't want to live in fear. Something was still out there, and if we didn't face it, it would follow us forever. The next morning, Mark and I met at a small diner just outside of the desert, our minds heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. We didn't speak much as we drove, the tension between us palpable. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but deep down, we both knew that we were walking into the unknown again. We reached the clearing by nightfall. The desert felt colder this time, more oppressive. The stars above seemed distant, like they were watching us, waiting for us to make our move. As we stepped into the clearing, the air grew heavier. The spirals were gone, but there was something else. A feeling, like a presence lingering just beyond the edge of our vision. And then I heard it. The whispers. "Emily. Mark." They were faint at first, almost inaudible, but they grew louder, more insistent. I felt a chill creep down my spine. We weren't alone. "This is it," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Whatever we did last time, we didn't finish it." And then, from the shadows, I saw her again. The witch. She stood at the altar, her eyes black as night, her smile wide and predatory. This time, though, she was not alone. The air around her shimmered, and I saw shapes, twisted, ghostly forms, swirling around her, moving in the dark like they were drawn to her power. "We shouldn't have come back," I whispered. Mark nodded grimly. "I know." The witch raised her hands, and the temperature dropped. The ground beneath us trembled, and the whispers grew louder, as if they were all around us now. "We've tried to run, tried to hide," she said in that same dry, cracked voice. "But you cannot escape the land, the curse. You have disturbed the balance, and now you will pay the price." I looked at Mark, fear and determination in his eyes. We had to do something. This wasn't just a fight for our lives, it was a fight for everything. The desert. The land. The power she held over us. I reached into my bag and pulled out the artifact. It still pulsed with the same energy it had the last time we faced her. It was time to finish this. For good. "We end this here," I said, my voice firm. Mark stepped forward, and together we raised the stone. The ground shook violently beneath our feet, the sky above us darkening as the witch screamed in fury. This time, we would make sure she stayed buried. Forever. As the stone pulsed in my hands, a violent wind whipped through the clearing, sending dust and debris flying in every direction. The witch's scream echoed through the desert, a high-pitched, bone-chilling wail that rattled the air. Her figure trembled, her form shifting and warping, but she didn't fall. Instead, she reached out toward us, her clawed fingers curling, her face contorted in a terrifying grin. "You think this will stop me?" she hissed, her voice like 1,000 cracking bones. But I didn't hesitate. Neither did Mark. We pressed the stone forward, and as we did, the ground beneath us rumbled louder, the desert itself groaning in protest. The air crackled with energy, and the light around us flickered, as if reality itself was on the verge of shattering. The artifact, the stone, began to glow brighter than before, its symbols pulsing with an intense, burning light. For a moment, the witch recoiled, her eyes widening with a mix of anger and fear. She understood what we were doing, understood that we were going to finish what we started. But it was too late. The light from the stone intensified, engulfing the witch in a blinding flare of energy. She screamed, a horrible, guttural sound that filled the entire desert, shaking the earth beneath our feet. The shapes swirling around her, those ghostly, twisted forms, began to dissolve, disintegrating into the air as the power of the artifact overwhelmed them. We didn't look away, even as the heat grew unbearable and the air shimmered with raw energy. We held the stone steady, our hands shaking but resolute. The witch's form began to crack, her skin peeling away like the bark of an ancient tree, revealing only darkness beneath. And then, with one final, earth-shattering scream, she exploded into nothingness, vanishing into the light. For a moment, all was silent. The wind stopped. The desert, once thick with tension, now felt still, almost peaceful. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the dimming light, and looked around. There was nothing left, no traces of the witch, no sign of the unnatural energy that had once tainted this place. Mark and I stood in the clearing, breathing heavily, both of us covered in sweat. The night air felt cool now, the oppressive heat gone, replaced by an eerie calm. "Is it over?" I whispered, my voice uncertain. Mark didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the spot where the witch had stood, his eyes distant. Finally, he nodded. "I think it is. But I don't think we'll ever fully understand what we disturbed here." This place, it's old. And something like that, something like her, can't just be erased. I felt a strange sadness settle over me. As much as we'd fought to end this, there was a part of me that knew we could never truly leave this place behind. The land held secrets, dark, ancient secrets, that we would never be able to unravel completely. "We've done all we can," I said quietly, turning toward the path leading out of the clearing. "Let's go home." Mark didn't say anything, but I saw the understanding in his eyes. We had both been through too much to stay in the desert any longer. We had faced something beyond our comprehension, something we could never unsee, and it was time to move on. For our own peace, for our own sanity. We walked out of the clearing together, the weight of what we had just done hanging over us. The whispers had stopped, the shadows had receded, but there was still a lingering sense of unease, like something was still watching us from just beyond the edge of the horizon. As we made our way back to the truck, I glanced at Mark. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and weary, but there was something else in his eyes, a quiet resolve. We both knew that, no matter what happened next, the desert would never truly let us go. We drove away in silence, leaving the Mojave Desert behind, but the memory of the witch, the terror, the power, and the land she had haunted, would never fade. Sometimes, when the world is still and the night is too quiet, I still hear the faintest whispers. And I wonder if the witch is truly gone, or if she's just waiting. Waiting for someone else to wander too far. To disturb the land once more. My name is Emily Carter. And I'm still not sure whether the desert is done with us, or if we're done with it. The drive back to civilization felt like a dream, as if the events that had unfolded in the desert weren't real. The weight of everything we'd faced, everything we'd done, seemed to lift as we passed through the gates of the desert, the miles between us and the Mojave growing wider. But even as the road ahead stretched out in front of us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly free. Mark and I parted ways when we reached the city, each of us carrying the same unspoken understanding. Our lives would never be the same. We had survived something impossible, something that defied reason, and now, we were left to pick up the pieces of our lives, trying to return to normal. But that lingering unease, it never fully went away. Back at home, I tried to settle into the rhythms of my old life, but everything felt off. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt hollow. The walls seemed to hold secrets I couldn't understand. I found myself walking through the rooms, touching objects, checking corners, always looking, always listening. I caught myself staring at the door or windows, convinced I could see something just beyond my view. And then, the dreams started. They were never the same, but they all had one thing in common, the desert. I would find myself back at that clearing, the altar still standing, the spirals glowing faintly in the dark. And she would be there, the witch, watching me, her eyes dark and knowing. But she wouldn't speak. She would just stare, her presence oppressive, as if waiting for me to make the first move. I woke up each morning drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the taste of fear lingering on my tongue. I would remind myself it was just a dream. Just my mind replaying the events, trying to make sense of them. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a dream. There was something still in the air, something I couldn't see, but that I could feel. One evening, a few weeks after our return, I received an unexpected message. It was from a number I didn't recognize. "Are you alone?" My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Who was this? How did they know about what had happened? I didn't want to respond, but I couldn't help myself. Who is this? I replied, my hands trembling. The response came quickly. It's not over. She's still out there, and she's looking for you. I can help. I felt a chill run down my spine. My fingers hovered over the phone, unsure whether to continue. But the words on the screen seemed to call out to me, to pull me in. I had to know. I had to understand. How do you know about her? I typed, my pulse quickening. I've been watching. I know what happened in the desert. I know what you did. But there's more. She's not done. She'll come for you, just like she did for me. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. I knew I shouldn't have responded. I knew I should have just walked away, but something about the message struck a nerve deep within me. How did this person know? Was it someone who had been to the desert? Someone who knew the same dark secrets we had uncovered? I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed, staring at the phone, waiting for another message. But it didn't come. Instead, the night stretched on in silence, the world outside my window eerily still. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That someone, or something, was waiting for me in the shadows. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I barely ate. Every creak in the house, every shift in the air, had me jumping. I started to feel like I was losing control, like the world around me was slipping away. I reached out to Mark. He didn't answer at first, but after a few hours, he finally returned my call. His voice sounded strained, like he hadn't slept in days. Emily, he said, his voice low. We can't keep running from this. We didn't finish it. She's still out there, and I think... I know, I interrupted, my voice shaking. I got a message. Someone knows what happened. They said she's coming for us. Mark went silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his words were slow, deliberate. We need to find out who this is. We need to make sure she doesn't find us first. I agreed. We had unfinished business. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't going to stop unless we confronted it once and for all. We began searching, digging through old records, online forums, anything we could find that might give us more information. And then, one night, Mark found something. A story, buried deep in a forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena. It was an account from someone who had been camping near Shadow Ridge, a person who had described seeing strange symbols and hearing whispers, much like we had. But there was more. This person had seen the woman, the witch, and they hadn't left. They had stayed and learned something dark, something ancient. They had found a way to contain the witch, to stop her from returning. But the price had been steep. Mark and I made a decision that night. We would find this person. We would get answers. The next morning, we packed our things once more and set out. We didn't know where it would lead, but we both knew that we couldn't stop now. The witch was still out there. And if we didn't stop her, she would never leave us alone. My name is Emily Carter. And I've learned that some things, once disturbed, can never truly be undone. And some forces, once awakened, can never be put back to sleep. As we drove deeper into the heart of the unknown, the unease between Mark and me grew heavier with every mile. The desert was vast, its emptiness stretching out in every direction. But I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how far we went, the witch's presence was still lingering just beyond the horizon, waiting for the right moment to strike. We followed the lead Mark had found in the forum, a name, an address, and a cryptic message. The person we were looking for was someone who had lived in a small town not far from the desert, someone who had supposedly encountered the witch and survived. But that didn't mean they were free. Far from it. The account in the forum spoke of dark rituals, ancient powers, and an undeniable sense of being haunted by something that never let go. The more I read, the more I felt that sinking feeling in my chest, the sense that we were diving headfirst into a nightmare we might not be able to escape. By the time we arrived at the small, run-down cabin on the edge of town, night had fallen. The air was thick with tension, and the wind howled through the trees, as though warning us to turn back. But we couldn't stop now. We had come too far. Mark knocked on the door, his fist making a sharp sound in the quiet of the night. A few moments passed before the door creaked open, revealing an older man. His face was weathered, his eyes hard, as if he had seen too much to ever be truly at peace. "You're here," he said simply, his voice rough with age. "We're looking for answers," Mark said, stepping forward. "We need to know how to stop her. The witch from Shadow Ridge. We think she's still out there. She's been hunting us." The man's expression didn't change. He looked at both of us for a long time, as if measuring us, before stepping aside and allowing us into the cabin. Once inside, the man, who introduced himself as Eli, told us what we needed to know. He had seen the witch himself, back when he was young. He had been camping, much like we had, drawn to the desert's vastness and solitude. And like us, he had stumbled upon the ancient symbols and the dark forces tied to that land. But unlike us, he hadn't left. Eli had stayed long enough to learn the truth. The witch was not just a spirit. She was a force, an ancient power that had been bound to the desert for centuries, feeding off the fear and darkness of those who wandered too close. She was the guardian of the land, but not in the way we understood guardianship. Her purpose was to protect the land, but she did so by feeding off anyone who dared disturb it. Those who crossed her would find themselves marked. And once marked, they were hers. Forever. "There's no escape," Eli said, his voice low and steady. "Not unless you do what I did." We leaned in, desperate to hear more. Eli paused before continuing, his eyes shifting nervously to the corners of the room as if expecting something to be watching him. "I found a way to contain her. But it's not a simple thing. It's a ritual, a binding ritual. You need to gather certain objects, certain items tied to the land itself. You have to make a sacrifice, and you have to face her. You can't back out. If you try, it'll be worse than before." I felt a chill run down my spine. "A sacrifice?" I asked, my voice trembling. Eli nodded. "Yes. A blood sacrifice. It's the only way to sever the connection. The witch feeds on fear, on life force. That's how she gains power. If you want to end it, you need to take that power away from her. You need to make her weak." The thought of what he was asking us to do was terrifying. But I knew, deep down, that there was no other choice. If we didn't stop her now, she would follow us forever. And even if we succeeded, would we ever truly be free? I looked at Mark, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. I could see that he knew this was the only way. "What do we need?" I asked Eli, my voice barely above a whisper. Eli gave us a list of objects, items that could be found only in the desert itself. Pieces of the land that had been touched by the witch's dark influence. And then, the hardest part, the blood sacrifice. He didn't tell us who or what we would have to offer, but he made it clear that we would know when the time came. The next morning, we set out, prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The desert was waiting for us, as it always had. The sun beat down relentlessly as we ventured deeper into the barren landscape, searching for the objects we needed. Each step felt like it was pulling us closer to something we couldn't outrun. We finally found what we needed, a collection of strange artifacts scattered around the ancient altar where we had first encountered the witch. There were stones, feathers, and bits of twisted, dried bone. The symbols etched into the ground were stronger here, more vibrant, as though the land itself was alive with dark energy. We gathered the items and prepared for the ritual, our nerves on edge. We knew what we had to do, but neither of us spoke of the sacrifice. We didn't need to. It hung between us, a dark promise that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. As the sun began to set, we began the ritual, placing the objects in their proper places around the altar. The air grew thick with anticipation, and the wind howled through the desert like the voice of something ancient. The ground trembled, and the sky darkened as the witch's presence began to stir. And then, she appeared. Her form materialized from the shadows, her black eyes gleaming in the fading light. Her smile was wide, jagged, full of hunger. "You think you can stop me?" she whispered, her voice a sound like dry leaves scraping across stone. Mark stepped forward, holding the artifact high, and began the incantation Eli had taught us. The words were foreign, old, and strange, and as he spoke, the witch's form began to flicker, like a flame in the wind. But it wasn't enough. With a scream, the witch lunged at us, her clawed hands outstretched, her eyes burning with fury. And in that moment, I knew what had to be done. Without thinking, I stepped forward, pulling from within me the strength I didn't know I had. I reached out and pressed the last item, the object that would complete the ritual, into the earth beneath the altar. The desert shook violently, and the witch's scream split the air. The ground cracked open beneath her, and the earth swallowed her whole, pulling her back into the land she had been bound to for centuries. For a moment, the world went quiet. The ritual was complete. We had stopped her. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, we hadn't finished what we started. That the desert, the land itself, would always remember us. Always remember her. And I wasn't sure if we had truly severed the connection or if the witch was simply lying in wait, waiting for the next soul to wander too far. My name is Emily Carter, and I don't think I'll ever escape the desert. No matter what happens, some things are never truly gone. As the silence settled over the desert, the weight of what we had just done pressed down on me. The witch was gone, at least, for now. The ground beneath the altar was still, and the faint glow of the symbols began to fade, leaving only dust and the fading remnants of the ritual. But despite the victory, a gnawing sense of unease lingered in the air. We stood there for a long time, both of us silent, processing the enormity of what had just transpired. The wind had stopped. The desert, which had once felt alive with danger, now felt strangely empty. But beneath that emptiness, I sensed something else, a darkness that we hadn't fully understood. Had we truly finished it? Or had we merely delayed the inevitable, Is it over? Mark asked, his voice breaking the silence, his eyes weary but still searching for an answer. I looked at him, unsure. The witch, the land, the strange connection, it all felt like a puzzle that we hadn't fully solved. I don't know, I whispered, my voice thick with exhaustion. But it's over for now. I think we've done what we can. Mark nodded, his face drawn. We may never know everything. But we have to move on. We can't keep looking over our shoulders forever. I wanted to believe that, wanted to take solace in the idea that we were free. But the whispers, the dreams, the feeling of being watched, they hadn't gone away. They were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. We gathered the remnants of the ritual, the artifacts, and the items that had once been part of the witch's power. As we turned to leave the clearing, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The altar stood there, silent, untouched. But it wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of something waiting. We left the Mojave Desert behind, driving back through the vast emptiness, neither of us speaking much. The long road stretched ahead, and the world seemed just as we had left it, but I knew better now. The desert held its secrets close, and the land would never forget. Back at home, Mark and I went our separate ways. We both tried to return to normalcy, to resume our lives. But there was a part of me that knew I would never truly be free. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind, every shadow in the corner of my eye made me wonder if she had followed us back. If the witch was truly gone, or if she had simply bided her time, waiting for the right moment to return. I found myself checking my phone more often than I should have, half expecting another message, another warning. But none came. The world felt eerily still. The desert was far away now, but the connection, the thread that tied me to it, remained. And I knew that, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape what had happened. Then, one day, a letter arrived. The envelope was old, the edges frayed, and there was no return address. My heart skipped a beat when I saw my name written in elegant, precise handwriting on the front. I opened it slowly, as if expecting something terrible to jump out at me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it was written a single sentence, the ink smudged in places as if written quickly. She is not gone. She is waiting, Emily. She will come again when you least expect it. My blood ran cold. The witch had left us with a warning. Or perhaps it wasn't a warning at all. Perhaps it was a promise. I stared at the paper, the words swimming before my eyes, but I knew what they meant. The witch wasn't gone. She was never gone. She had only retreated into the shadows, biding her time until the right moment came. I folded the letter carefully, my hands shaking. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, this was not the end. I thought back to the desert, to the altar, to the power that had been sealed away. I had felt it, the pull of the land, the call of something ancient, something powerful. The witch was tied to the desert, but she was tied to me too, in ways I could never fully understand. I don't know what's next. I don't know when she will come back, or how, but I know one thing for sure. The witch is still out there. And I will never escape her. My name is Emily Carter, and I don't think any of us ever truly leave the desert. The land has a way of keeping you. And no matter how far you run, there are some things that always find their way back to you. It's been years now. The days have passed in a blur, time seeming to stretch and warp, never quite feeling real. I've tried to rebuild my life. I've tried to move on. But every time I think I've found a sense of peace, the desert calls to me again. It's like the land itself is always waiting, always pulling me back into its dark embrace. I've tried to tell myself that I'm done, that the witch is gone, that she was nothing more than a haunting memory, a nightmare I survived. But no matter how hard I try to forget, I can't escape the feeling that something is watching me. That something is waiting. The whispers haven't stopped, not entirely. They come in the dead of night, soft at first, like the wind rustling through trees. But when I listen closely, I hear it, my name, faint but unmistakable. I never expected to be here again. But one fateful evening, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from Mark. "Emily," he said, his voice urgent, strained. "I think we were wrong. We didn't finish it. I've found something that says the witch's curse wasn't broken. I don't know how, but I think she's been waiting. Watching us." I couldn't breathe for a moment. I couldn't comprehend what he was saying. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "There's more to the land. More than we realized. The witch, she's not bound by death. She's tied to something deeper, something older than we ever understood. And I think she's coming for us." The words hit me like a tidal wave. I couldn't believe it, not after everything we had done, everything we'd been through. How could it still be possible? But deep down, I knew. I felt it. The same cold dread that had filled me before. The same fear that had never truly left. That night, I packed my things once again, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to go back. But I had no choice. I had to face whatever was left of the witch. I had to finish this, once and for all. Mark and I met at the same diner, the same place where we had begun this journey together. His face was as pale as mine, his eyes haunted by the same knowledge. We both knew that this was the final step. The desert would not let us go until we did what we needed to. We set off toward the Mojave Desert once again. As we drove, the weight of the past seemed to press in on us, the road ahead stretching into an uncertain future. We didn't speak much, there were no words left. There was only the pull of destiny, of something we had set in motion, and which now demanded to be completed. We arrived at the altar by midnight. The air was thick with the scent of dust and earth, and the desert felt colder than before. There was no sign of the witch. No sign of the power that had once plagued us. But I could feel it, just beneath the surface, like the calm before a storm. The altar was still there, as it had always been. The spirals that once glowed in the night were now faded, their energy nearly gone. Yet, there was a sense of anticipation, like the land was holding its breath. Mark looked at me, his face set in grim determination. "It ends here," he said. "We finish this tonight." I nodded, my heart heavy. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know exactly how to undo what had been done. But we had no choice but to try. Together, we began the ritual again, but this time, something was different. The ground trembled as we placed the final pieces of the ritual. The wind picked up, swirling around us, but it wasn't natural, it felt like something else. Something alive. And then, as the last of the incantation left my lips, I felt her presence. The witch. She emerged from the darkness, her figure shifting like smoke in the wind. Her eyes were darker than I remembered, and her smile, twisted and hungry, was wider than before. "You came back," she whispered, her voice low and dangerous. "You cannot escape what you've awakened." Her words didn't scare me anymore. I wasn't running. Not this time. "We finished this," I said, my voice steady, but my body trembling. "Once and for all." Mark and I stood side by side, the power of the ritual building between us. I could feel it, the energy crackling in the air, as if the desert itself was reacting to what we were doing. The witch roared in fury, but it was too late. The binding was complete. The power we had summoned engulfed her, and she screamed, a sound that tore through the very fabric of the night. For the first time, she seemed truly afraid. Her form twisted and writhed as the ritual pulled her back into the earth, back into the land she had once ruled. And then, with one final, deafening scream, she was gone. The desert went silent. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. We didn't know what would happen next. We didn't know if the land would ever fully heal, or if the witch's power would ever truly fade. But in that moment, we knew we had done what was necessary. We had faced her, and we had won. As we left the Mojave Desert for the last time, I glanced back at the place where it had all begun. The wind had died down, and the air felt still. For the first time in years, I could breathe easily. I didn't know what the future held, or what kind of scars the desert would leave on me. But I knew one thing for sure. The witch was gone. And I was finally free. My name is Emily Carter. And I've learned that some things are meant to stay buried, hidden beneath the surface of the earth, where they belong. But the desert has a way of calling. And sometimes, when you answer, you find yourself facing the darkness, not just to survive, but to overcome. And when you do, you can finally walk away. Or at least, that's what I hope. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.